So welcome everybody. There are so many ways to celebrate Yom Yerushalayim. And one of my favorite ways is to learn some history, to give us, and in this case, to give us an appreciation of the city that we love so much. Wait, can everybody hear? Is everybody good? Just raise hands, say hello. Okay, great. So if you have questions, Stephen is going to help us out here, but either use the chat. Is the chat on, Stephen? Yeah.
Yes, the chat is on.
I don't see it. Or raise your hand. Stephen will unmute you. Okay. Today we're going to talk in particular about the women of Jerusalem, and in particular, the women of the Evelina de Rothschild School in Jerusalem. Its founder, Annie Landau, who is a great topic, but also, and I want to make sure that we have a chance to talk about some of the alumni, some of the students who have been produced by the school, because they have had an enormous impact on Jerusalem, on the state of Israel in general. Some of their stories are well known, but actually not so much. But today I actually want to talk about them, not only just for their stories, but also as alumna of Evelina de Rothschild School and products of Annie Landau's vision. So the reason I came to even know about, I've always heard of Evelina de Rothschild, and some of you may have heard me speak about this before. And the reason, but I'm going to speak about things that I haven't spoken about also. The reason I came to know about I've always known that Evelina de Rothschild existed, and anybody who lives in Jerusalem, who has friends in Jerusalem, knows about that, because it's this very wonderful, elite, progressive school in Jerusalem. And a number of years ago, quite a few years ago, a professor at Hunter, Laura Shore, did research and created a book about the school, the history of the school, in particular about its founder, Annie Landau. How did I come across the book? Eli Benin invited Laura Shore to come to Deal and do and present about the book, because are there any Benins here, or Shamas or Suttons? Eli's great, I think, grandmother was actually one of the, hi, Leah Harari, good, so you can help me out here. So Eli's and Laura's, you can tell me how many greats, was one of the, not original, but the teachers in this school. I'm gonna say very, very early 20th century. And her daughters actually went to the school. I think there are pictures of them in the school. And in Laura Shore's book, she actually talks about Mademoiselle Citon, right? Her name, it was Sutton, but she was called Mademoiselle Citon, who was one of the most important and beloved kindergarten teachers in the school when Annie Landau arrived in 1899. So I thank you, Eli, because reading this book has taught me so much about extraordinary women, but also reading a book like this gives us a window into the history of Jerusalem and into the history of Zionism that's, what we call a social history. I've spoken about this often, that often gives us a feeling, a sense, not of how things evolved in the political, military, geopolitical, economic arena, but on the ground. How was society shaped? How was community shaped? And these are really the forces that are the foundation of the Zionist enterprise. As in all love stories, and as in all history, there are good times and there are painful times. And Jews are actually particularly expert at experiencing both at the same time, right? Any holiday and any celebration that we have, tends to collapse and blend our memories, our painful memories, with our our memories of celebration and redemption. And this is acutely true of the history of Jerusalem. At the turn, we're going to start our journey. We're going to start talking right at the turn of the 20th century. And the turn of the 20th century was actually a very dangerous place. Jerusalem was a very dangerous place for a young girl to live. Not just at the turn of the century, but I would say in the at least four or so decades before the 20th century, the last half of the 19th century, and certainly into the first few decades of the 20th century. Jerusalem in particular was a dangerous place, and it was particularly dangerous for young girls. So Palestine in general, we think of it as a dangerous place. We learn about, about violence. We learn about the chalutzim and malaria and the problems with building the land. But Jerusalem was uniquely difficult. It was a place for Jews where there was deep poverty, and not just poverty, but poverty that was culturally induced to a degree. We'll talk about that later. Malnutrition for girls, very early marriage. They were being married off at 13, 14. Severe maternal mortality, health crises, crowded urban conditions with a deadly lack of infrastructure for sanitation, hygiene, medicine, prostitution. The kind of prostitution that happens when there are impoverished, hopeless conditions. And that existed for young Jewish women in Jerusalem as well. And that's not as well known, but very real. In the last half of the 19th century, there was sudden population growth with inadequate institutional growth. Ottoman law, remember Jerusalem is under Ottoman law, which was at best fickle vis-a-vis non-Muslims. And of course, famously, these are the things that we all kind of are front forward in our consciousness. At times, some terrible violence. There were riots, and then in the period that we're going to be talking about, World War I, but not much later, World War II is in addition. But remember that the violence and the impact of World War I was actually very immediate in what was then Palestine, right? It didn't actually reach Jerusalem, but it was very close to Jerusalem. And the Ottomans were at war. And that had a tremendous impact on Jerusalem. And we'll talk about that as we go. So why Jerusalem? Why was Jerusalem so unique? Well, Jerusalem was old and new in unique ways. It was a very diverse, colorful blend of religious Jews from all four corners of the earth, who came to Jerusalem for its holiness, which contributed to poverty and social divisions. It wasn't, if you were a modern Zionist at the end of the 19th century, let's say in Eastern Europe, you typically, and you were interested in coming to build the land, to plant, to build agricultural settlements, let's say, you didn't come to Jerusalem, you came to the north, or you went to the coast, right? The people who were in Jerusalem was for Jews, it was a very religious city, not just for Jews actually, and we'll talk about that also. For a few hundred years before that, Jews had come from all over the Ottoman Empire, also from Eastern Europe, in particular from Hasidic communities, also followers of the Vilna Gaon, for instance. So there were old Sephardic communities. And the level of poverty was severe there too, but they were actually working. They were shopkeepers, tailors, urban types of work, which was not easy. Also in the Sephardic community, there were actually some aristocratic families, rabbinic and entrepreneurial, right? There was some very important families of rabbis who continued to have impact through the 20th century. Also entrepreneurial. For instance, there was an old Sephardic family who founded one of the early printing presses in Israel. In the older Ashkenazi communities, they were very impoverished, and that was complicated by the fact that by choice and by ideology, the Ashkenazic Jewish communities tended to be living based on subsisting on the Chalukah system. The Chalukah system was this practice of rabbis and Jewish leaders going to Europe and to the Middle East, collecting money for the Jewish community in Israel, and then Chalukah, right, dispersing it among Jews in Jerusalem. This encouraged Talmud Torah and deeply religious, Orthodox communities and intensely Orthodox communities, but at the same time, it also encouraged dependency and poverty. Here too, there was an aristocracy of leadership. There were very important rabbis and even some important business people. Also, the printing presses keep coming up. Those were very important early businesses. But things were very difficult. Typical of society under Ottoman rule, the tiny communities in Jerusalem tended to fend for themselves. They built shuls, they built very small schools, of course, mostly for boys, in the languages and the customs of the places that they had come from. So they spoke in the schools and in their homes, they spoke Yiddish, Ladino, Arabic. Hebrew typically was reserved for Torah only. To envision an infrastructure on a large community level just was not done in these communities. These are people who weren't envisioning, right, the creation of a larger Jewish society in Israel. I don't think they were even envisioning their way out of Ottoman rule. And everybody lived pretty much side by side, not just side by side, but smushed together in very crowded conditions with Arab, Muslims, and Christians. By the mid-19th century, something very important happens. There's a growing influx of Europeans who had become very intrigued by the Middle East since Napoleon, and by the very early 20th century, the discovery of oil. You all know about this because of architecture in Jerusalem that's very familiar to you, the Russian compound, churches in very distinctly European styles, the onion domes, and the French and the German architecture. Also, some of the most important archaeology that we know about, ancient archaeology, was unearthed during this period. The tunnels, the Chizkiyahu tunnel, in Ir David, for instance, was discovered because of this European excitement and intrigue with the Middle East. The Geniza was discovered for the same reason. Also literature. This is the period where you have people like Mark Twain and Melville and others, Western writers, coming to Jerusalem, being very, moved, almost mystically moved, and writing about Jerusalem and its Jews. Missionaries, Christian institutions flooded Jerusalem at this time as well. That was a great sending for England or France or Germany or Russia to send church leaders to build religious Christian institutions, and in particularly missions, was a great way to extend their influence, right, their government's influence, and plant it very deeply into Jerusalem. So these Christian institutions, and the missionaries in particular, helped to develop institutions that were very important for society and even for Jews. This is when you start to see hospitals and orphanages, for instance. But of course, these were institutions that came with strings attached, sometimes outright proselytizing, and sometimes sort of well-meaning. They didn't say that they were proselytizing, but of course, once a child or a Jew came into the hospitals or the schools, the influence was subtle but very powerful. And it was hard to resist because they were the only ones offering this type of help. So at that point, we also start to see Jewish interventions. Let me just watch my clock. We start to see Jewish interventions from Europe. Philanthropists from England and France and Germany, the Rothschilds, the Montefioris are very famous. And they started to build communities outside the old city, which was countryside, and hospitals and schools where Jewish people could come without the danger of missionizing and proselytizing. But still, it was hard to compete with institutions that provided nutrition, healthcare, clothing, as the Christian institutions did, and many children were recruited and attended those schools. The newer Jewish schools that were created were very important. The Alliance Française, created schools in Jerusalem for boys and girls. The German Hilfsverein instituted schools. For those of you who know Jerusalem, Chorev comes out of that German tradition. But none of these schools, none of these efforts grew as large over the years, and none of them lasted as long, it still exists today, as the Evelina de Rothschild School, right? That was founded in 1954, and which Annie Landau took over in 1900. And certainly none had the enormous impact on its students, on Jerusalem, and I would say even on the Zionist enterprise as Evelina de Rothschild did. For many reasons, it was very, very important. It had this impact for many reasons. Its impact, its size, and its lasting. The fact that it's lasted so long. First and foremost, because of the arrival in Jerusalem in 1899 of Annie Landau. Even when, and this relates to another issue, even when philanthropy flowed from Europe, imagine how difficult, almost impossible it was to find qualified educators and administrators and teachers. It was hard to live in Jerusalem, in particular for a European. To stay more than a couple of years was really difficult, especially for single women, and that's who they were recruiting. Annie Landau showed up, and she never gave up. She never let up. She only left Jerusalem a few times. Periodically, she would go to England to report on the school and to continue to raise money. And once, the only other time she left Jerusalem was during World War I, because during World War I, the Ottoman Empire expelled all non-Ottoman citizens. It actually gave Jews who were living in Palestine a choice to abandon, let's say, their English citizenship and become an Ottoman citizen, and many people did. Eliyahu Ben Salha A did. One of the people who we're going to talk about, Helena Kagan, did, but Annie Landau was very stubborn. She absolutely refused to give up her English citizenship, and she ended up staying in Alexandria for a few years during World War I. Landau, in addition to her just absolute passion and extraordinary capability as an administrator, he had a clear and articulated mission which propelled her in ways that the other schools didn't. The young women, her understanding of her school was, her understanding of the mission of her school, her understanding of the mission of the school, I see you, Maris, thank you, was that her understanding of the school was that the young women of Jerusalem were an untapped resource that would be absolutely crucial for the development of a Jewish national homeland. So she wasn't just responding to, let's say, educational needs, health needs, like all these other institutions. She actually saw Evelina as the future of a Jewish homeland. And I can actually quote to you from some things that she wrote about this, but I think I'm not going to have time. Another problem that the other schools had was, as we said before, the schools tended to respond to the needs of very specific and different communities. a French school, a Yiddish-speaking school, Ashkenazi school, Sparta school, and so on. This is a very old pattern in Jerusalem. Landau demolished that model consciously. She believed that her school, first and foremost, was the best school for any girl who lived in Jerusalem. And in short time, by the way, others realized this as well. Even the Muslim Effendi, one of them of Jerusalem, and some other Ottoman Turkish families.
Hi, guys.
Sent their daughters to Jerusalem, to Evelina, because of its high standards, and also because they didn't like the proselytizing that was happening in the Christian schools. Everybody came to Evelina. Everybody was welcome. Wealthier families paid tuition. Poor families came for free. Old-time aristocratic families, newly arrived refugees, and in particular, after, even before World War I, but certainly after, in the 30s and 40s, there was a tremendous and very difficult influx of refugees from Europe. Sephardic, Ashkenazic, religious, unreligious, non-religious. It was inclusive and in a way that was unheard of in Jerusalem at that time. And there was plenty of opposition to that, right? There were people who, you can imagine, there were Orthodox rabbis who complained that their daughters or their community's daughters were going to school with non-religious girls or girls from other communities and so forth. Landau tended to overcome this by convincing and enlisting the mothers. She spent her time visiting poor hovels where her students lived. She would convince the mothers to allow their daughters to stay in school for a few extra years instead of getting married so young. She would teach hygiene and nutrition in the homes, but also, by the way, at the same time that her life consisted of that, she spent time in those types of settings, but at the same time, she lived in an apartment. Their school was in different places at different times, but she actually had brought china and silver and elegant housewares from England, and she was determined. She hosted Shabbat meals and holiday meals. It reportedly were elegant and magnificent and beautiful, beautifully set table and zemirot, singing, and divrei Torah. People in Jerusalem, she would invite a very wide range of people. People in Jerusalem tended to socialize all different kinds of people together in those echelons, and the people have written about this. Most important, though, she had the vision to see clearly that the new Jewish homeland would need women from all the sectors of at the time Palestine society, and that they would have to learn how to communicate with each other and live with each other side by side and work together. And she had the audacity to firmly believe, and this is really important, that every girl in Jerusalem, from preschool through high school, needed to learn English language, and she gets into trouble for that. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Needed to learn English, needed to learn a vocation or a profession to sustain her independently, to learn the disciplines of hygiene, punctuality, social skills, and appreciation of the arts, participation in organized youth activities. Scouts were very big then, still are in Israel, have athletic experiences, a good English education, all in the context of uncompromising, but fairly modern and serious Torah education for girls, including tefillah every morning, with the girls leading the tefillah, which was very pioneering. When Laura Shore researched the book by doing really amazing and extensive oral histories with graduates of Evelina, and they all talk about cherishing the Sidurim and the Humashim, which Landau inscribed for them, and they cherished them their whole lives, whether they were religious girls or non-religious girls, whether they ended up Orthodox or not. This was her educational vision, but even beyond that, the school became a haven, an oasis, where these girls learned about a world, that there was a world, and I'm quoting from Shore here, beyond sandbags and barbed wire, beyond poverty and disease, and beyond religious hatred. The women talk, the graduates of Evelina talk about their unusual ability to live in different worlds, communicate with tolerance, and actually in their lives, in their future lives, they did. We have a minute about a graduate who ended up in Yemen organizing the Yemenite Aliyah from Yemen, in Saigon doing medical work, and in Beirut, even as a spy for the Mossad. So where did Annie Landau herself come from? So she was born in London to a family, to a couple who had come from Eastern Europe by way of Germany. At a certain point, I guess for high school, her family sent her to Frankfurt, where her mother's family lived, to study at a new high school that Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch had created for girls. And she talked about this being kind of formative for her, being sent away, having the independence to be sent away, live in a different community, and in particular, live in a community where women's education was really, women's Jewish education was valued. That, I think, is one of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch's less heralded contributions and innovations. He taught, Rav Hirsch taught a system of absolute commitment to Torah and Halacha in conjunction with general studies, and his vision that this would not only help a Jew navigate the world successfully, but also deepen and enrich their Torah. When she came back to England, she studied education, and she famously, and in a very pioneering moment, she absolutely refused to take exams on Shabbat, successfully petitioning her authorities, right? Sort of foreshadowing her real uncompromising commitment and also stubbornness. She arrived in Jaffa, in Jerusalem first, in Jaffa and then Jerusalem, with skills, religious ideals, with the ability to live in different milieu. And most crucial, she had this confidence and conviction and vision. It never occurred to Annie Landau that anything she believed in could be impossible. So if this sounds like another hero, like another heroic pioneering woman who innovated in Jewish education in the very beginning of the 20th century, who else might I be talking about? Who's been in my classes? Sarah Schneerer, right? The founder of the Beis Yaakov movement. And there are, quite a few parallels. First of all, Sarah Schneerer is also influenced, right? She's Eastern European, but she spent time in Vienna, and at which time she came under the influence of a student of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. And it's that approach to Torah and Derech Eretz that she brought with her to Eastern Europe from Vienna, and also clarity about the importance of teaching Torah to girls. But there are other parallels too. Both Annie Landau and Sarah Schneerer realized very quickly the importance of teacher training, and they both invested in teacher training and sent out newly trained teachers all over the Jewish world. Evelina teachers actually went to Europe even and Australia to teach. But maybe even more important, in each case, they created a sense of identity and pride for the institution. Beis Yaakov girls, and Evelina graduates have a sense of community amongst them and an identity imbued by their unique institutions. Alumna of both schools are remarkably and acutely conscious and aware of the unique impact that their schools had on their own development, but also on the Jewish world. They almost feel kind of sort of set apart. They're kind of an elite force, and they're conscious of that. And this is really a reflection of both leaders, right? Their personalities and the kind of vision that they had. Annie Landau's conviction, right? When I talked about her absolute conviction, just to give a few examples, one of the most important, and as you can imagine, her school being unique in certain ways invited opposition. She believed very deeply in teaching Hebrew, right? She believed that, of course, that Hebrew, first of all, when we talked about the diverse families that her students came from, she saw Hebrew as the most important unifying force, and of course, as the language that the new homeland was going to be built with. However, and she was adamant that she was very passionate. She actually, Eliezer Ben Yehuda's wife was one of the teachers that she hired to teach Hebrew in the school. Also, there was a very important expert in Hebrew language instruction, Rabbi, I can't remember his first name, Miyuchas, from one of the old Sephardic families in Jerusalem, who developed Hebrew language instruction, but she was adamant that the students had to learn English. And there were two reasons for this, or two reasons that she gave. One of the reasons was that in the early parts of the 20th century, she felt that there weren't adequate textbooks available to teach certain subjects, and in Hebrew yet, right, that hadn't been quite developed yet, and she was insistent on importing English textbooks for that. But it was really much further. I think she really believed that it was important to understand English in order to navigate the world. First of all, remember, this is even before the British mandate, right? But even then, she was an English woman, so she felt that English language and culture was paramount. But she had a feeling that English was going to be a very, very important tool and passport for her girls in the world. And it proved correct, because once the British, after World War I, when the British, with the onset of the British mandate, her students, because of their English, were hired and participated in very important leadership roles all over what was then Palestine. But she got into a lot of trouble. I can't remember the year. It was before World War I. There was actually a strike. Eliezer Ben Yehuda and most of the Zionist leadership wanted the schools all over Palestine to be completely in Hebrew. And there was actually I can't remember what it's called, there was a strike that was organized all over the Yishuv, all over in Israel and Palestine, demanding that the schools stop teaching any other language, because at the time, French was being taught still at the Alliance schools, German was taught in certain schools, Yiddish in other schools. There was this tremendous opposition to Hebrew. And Annie Landau stood her ground. There were teachers who left, there were students who didn't go to school, but she absolutely stood her ground and continued and insisted that Evelina be bilingual. She was also very troubled by and stubbornly opposed to superstitious behavior. She writes about kind of like yanking amulets off the girls who came to school and marching into their homes and convincing their mothers about the uselessness of superstition and amulets. And I think what drove that was actually because she was worried that it was going to get in the way of modern medicine. And certainly to the Orthodox opposition to diversity and to socializing. Even her own socializing was criticized by some in the Orthodox community, because she actually socialized actively with, and this was common at this time, with Arabs and with Christians, with Jews of all different types. Really, they, in a funny way, they coexisted, they dialogued together at that time. It was a unique moment. I promised that I would talk about not just one woman, but women. And it's actually easy to do that, because heroic women like Annie Landau tend to be mentors, and they have close friendships with other women. So we know about women who saw her as a role model, and also about some of her friends who were among the most courageous, powerful, impactful, but often forgotten women of 20th century Zionism. And I'm going to give you a glimpse into some of them. One of her closest friends and partners came to Jerusalem in 1914 from Europe. Her name was Dr. Helena Kagan. She came to be known as the Children's Doctor of Jerusalem. She came in 1914 after getting her medical degree in Switzerland. And she came because she had gone from Russia to Switzerland, and her father was very sick. When she went back to take care of him, it was actually in Tashkent, her father on his deathbed begged her, his children, to go to Israel, right, to fulfill his Zionist dream. So sure enough, she came to Israel in 1914, and it's worth reading a little bit to you of her impressions. It's great stuff. I wanted to, just a little bit of her impressions. Of Jerusalem. Boundless ignorance, superstition were added to extreme poverty. The sanitary situation, and this is 1914, like already well into the second decade of the 20th century, rubbish, rats, millions of flies and mosquitoes, no central water supply, taps were a rare sight, water was collected during the rainy season and so on. Sometimes the cisterns, the collected water was so infested that the bad smell and taste of the water made it unsuitable for drinking, and so on. Food hygiene was on a particularly low level. Vegetables were irrigated with sewage and were a main cause of dysentery, typhoid of all kinds, meat came, and so on and so forth. Cow's milk was often dangerous, infested with bacteria. Now, she came to Jerusalem, Dr. Helena Kagan. The Ottomans wouldn't recognize her medical degree, maybe because she was very young and a woman. She was, I think, 25. She just agreed to work as a nurse for a while. And in the face of severe infant malnutrition, she bought a cow and began to distribute fresh milk to mothers with young babies, and continued throughout her life to create institutions and to, during World War I, I'm sure you've been to Tico House, to Beit Tico, to the restaurant, right? Everybody has eaten that beautiful restaurant, right? Well, it's called Tico House because there's one of my favorite painters lived there, but her husband, Dr., I can't remember his first name, Tico, was an ophthalmologist who treated all the children of Jerusalem, Arabs and Jews, and he was expelled by the Ottomans during World War I. So Helena Kagan took over his clinic and treated the children of Jerusalem. The Ticos were very close friends with Helena Kagan, not Elena Kagan, and with Annie Landau, and he treated hundreds and hundreds of girls in Evelina as well. We're going to talk in a little bit about another couple. Why were they forgotten? They weren't political leaders and not even Zionist ideologues. Annie Landau in particular kind of avoided talking about Zionism per se, although I think they were all deeply, passionately Zionist to their cores. Their work was more in shaping society, humanity, the infrastructure of life, without which the state of Israel could not have been built. They really literally built the foundation, even in terms of structures and institution. And their work was ongoing, not on the stage of war or dramatic political scenes. The redemptive roles that they played were more obscure. For instance, even during World War I, which is sort of a period of history that's less typically studied than, because it was eclipsed by the really perhaps much more dramatic crises that followed the Holocaust and the establishment of the state and the early wars. But they're worth study, just as these women's contributions are. When we think about the forces that propel history, we look at social, economic, political factors, and very often there's a conversation about who really makes history happen. Is it these forces, or is it extraordinary personalities? And when it comes to women, we do know that extraordinary has to be extraordinarily extraordinary, because to get anything done historically, and certainly in Ottoman and Mandate Palestine as a woman, required supernatural passion, guts, courage, stubbornness, and a deep love of Jerusalem. For a few examples, there are fun, I want to talk about, I think we're running out of time. So the examples I'm going to, let's see, yeah, we are. So the two examples I want to just add, I want to develop for a few minutes, are two alumna of Evelina. One is Shula Cohen Kishik. Have you heard of her? Has anybody, have you ever heard of her? She's a graduate of Evelina. She was born, she was born in the early 19s, I think, in Buenos Aires, because her father was a chief rabbi of Jerusalem. Her mother came from a very prominent Sephardic family in Jerusalem. Her mother had gone to Evelina as a child. They moved to Buenos Aires, came back to Jerusalem, and she and a few of her sisters went to Evelina. So much of her life is so typical of, and is a good reflection, a window into this period in Jerusalem's history. But then things take a turn, and she attributes it to Evelina. When she was 13, her father, the family was in dire financial straits, and her father decided to go back to Buenos Aires to be a rabbi in Buenos Aires. And he took her with him. He needed someone. He took his 13-year-old daughter with him, took her out of school at Annie Landau's, even despite her protestations. He took her to Buenos Aires, and within 3 years, he found a husband for her in Beirut, right? A Lebanese Jew who is at least 15 years older than her, I think maybe even more. And she got married, she says maybe against her will, and sent to live in Beirut with this affluent, successful businessman. And when she comes to Beirut, she kind of gets acclimated a little, and she talks in her memoirs about living in a beautiful apartment, and she would look outside her window or be on the porch, and she would listen downstairs. There were Jewish kids, children, teenagers getting together in Shabbat groups or something like this, but she only heard them singing in Ladino and Arabic. And it frustrated her, and she says, because she had gotten this beautiful Hebrew education from Evelina, and she saw it as like essential for Jewish children. And she says in her memoirs, I remember Miss Landau. They were speaking French and Arabic, not Ladino. That makes more sense. I remember Miss Landau, the principal of Evelina, telling us that if something is not in order, one should examine myself first before blaming others. Am I guilty of not going downstairs to teach them to sing in Hebrew? I contemplated, but she was having trouble with it because she was very restricted. Her husband and his family did not want her going downstairs, didn't want her working or involving herself in anything like this. And she was very, very frustrated. And finally, she just went down and started to teach them Hebrew songs. The reaction from her husband's family was swift and very negative. They were furious at her, but she persisted. She waited a few weeks, and then she resumed, and she wrote them a letter. She wrote, very, very strong letter. I want to see one soul of all Wadi Yahud, that was the neighborhood in Lebanon, who will teach me, Shula, the daughter of Meir and Allegra Arazi from Jerusalem, how to maintain family honor. So I taught some Jews to sing Zionist songs. What is so terrible about that? And she persisted, and she continued. She even imported Hebrew textbooks from Israel. She had to remove all Zionist content so as not to anger the Lebanese authorities. And she created classes about Hebrew classes and Zionism classes. Now that's only the beginning of her story, because as the years went on, she and her husband both became involved in these efforts. By the late 30s and 40s, the British and the Arabs were not allowing Jewish immigration into Palestine, and it was a time when Jews were trying to get into Palestine, not just from Europe, but all over the Middle East, and Beirut was a stop-off point. Many of Beirut's Jews had left, and this is something we are familiar with, and gone to live in South America or New York and so on, but she got very involved in smuggling Jews into, across the British embargoes into Palestine. And then eventually, and this is not so clear, it is really clear, she worked for the Mossad. She became a spy for the Mossad, and she actually was imprisoned in Beirut for, I think, 6 years. She went through a very, very severe imprisonment. And finally, it was during the 6-Day War when Israel took Lebanese prisoners. Israel, through a prisoner swap, brought her to Jerusalem. That's how she finally got back to Jerusalem. And in her memoir, she talks a lot. I mean, she in herself is so extraordinary, but she talks a lot about being an alumna of Evelina de Rothschild, that this is everything she is, came from the vision of the unique vision of Evelina de Rothschild. And the other one, I'll just end with this, is Masha Weingarten Kaplan. And you might know about her if you've read, it's a beautiful book. It's a young adult book. I think it's called Forever My Jerusalem. It's a young adult book, but okay, Stephen, thank you. I'll be finished in a second. And her father was made the Muhtar, the Jewish Muhtar. Her father was a rabbi in the Rova, in the Old City, and he'd been made a Muhtar of Jerusalem. And because of that, she ended up being in Jerusalem during the siege, in the Old City during the siege of 1948. She was captured she was a nurse, and she was captured and brought to Jordan as a prisoner of war and stayed there for many, many months, and then eventually returned to Jerusalem. And she actually was instrumental in organizing the logistics and the whole process of bringing the Jews of Yemen, of Taiman, to Israel, right? And she too, in her memoirs, in her life story, views her experience in Evelina as formative and as the force that propelled her and enabled her to be this little girl who came out of a hovel in an old city, in the Old City of Jerusalem, and to be able to operate on really an international stage and contribute to the state of Israel. All these women, Annie Landau, Helena Kagan, Shula Cohen Kishik, Masha Weingarten Kaplan, these are women who just adored Jerusalem. They talk a lot about, they say, how much their love affair with Jerusalem. And I'm happy to share with you on Yom Yerushalayim their stories and give them back some love as well. Chag Sameach. Any questions? I think I don't know what's in the chat. Okay. I did mention Shore, Sarah Schneerer. All right. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Hi, Rabbi Towel. It's such an honor. Hi, Efrat. Hi, El. Hi, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. Efrat Segura's mother went to Evelina de Rothschild, and I'm sure you know other people too. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for coming.